Well, this will be a bit more freewheeling. We're going to have kind of off the top of the head conversation. I'll guide us through it, but our primary objective here is to look at Iran, Russia, China, that nexus, that malign axis, and their influence in Latin America. So we have a lot of places to go with that. Before we do that, though, I think that our panelists can talk about themselves better than I ever could. So let us start in the end and introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, sharing those important issues. I am John Griffiths, a former Lieutenant General of the Chilean Army. I was retired in 2018, and currently I am the Chief of Research of a new think tank called AthenaLab.
Well, I'm Christian Azevedo from Brazil. I'm very thankful for SFS for inviting me here. I am a career federal agent with the Brazilian Federal Police. Now I'm serving as the Undersecretary of Justice and Public Security in the state of Minas Gerais. I'm also an academic researcher. The themes that we're going to talk tonight is my research on my master's and my PhD. And I also work with some research groups in Latin America on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Joseph, for inviting me as well. My name is Mariano Federici. I am currently a Senior Managing Director at K2 Integrity, which is a financial crimes risk management firm based here in Washington. But prior to joining K2 Integrity, I was the head of financial intelligence of the Republic of Argentina under Mauricio Macri's administration, and spent 4 years investigating financial crimes, corruption, terrorist financing, money laundering in my country. That's my specialty. I'm a lawyer by profession as well.
Great. So you can see a quite distinguished panel, and we're glad to have all of you here, and I thank you for your time. So let me start us off with something that I reported in the past week or so. It came from the Farsi language press, the Iranian state-controlled press, and that was a report that Iran is sending warships into the Panama Canal. And they're doing this relatively soon. They're bragging about it in their press, and obviously there's a propaganda element to this, but I think there's also a very strategic military part of this. And that's where I'd like to begin. When I wrote that article, a lot of the reaction I got from people was shock. Why would Iran be going there? Is this something new that's happening? And what I told them, and I think our panelists know, is that this is not something new. Iran has had interest in the region for quite some time, along with their allies, Russia and China. And I'd like to start us there, and I'll throw it out to all of you if we can. What is Iran's interest in the region? Why would they send warships into the Panama Canal? And talk to us a little bit about the links that Iran has really had in Latin America for decades now. This is, in fact, not new. This is the culmination rather than the start of something.
Well,
Please.
no, go ahead.
And, first I just have to state a disclaimer that my opinions and analysis that I'm gonna say here those of my own, they do not necessarily reflect the Brazilian government or the Brazilian Federal Police.
Yes.
So having said that, it's important. The way I see it from my perspective and my experience is that Iran, through its proxy, Hezbollah, has been operating in the region for more than 3 decades. And they are an extension of Iran's policies in Latin America, not only in the southern cone, in which they are very kind of visible in the tri-border area between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, but in other places like in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Chile, and Peru, and Panama. And they, from my point of view, also what I have seen is that they have embedded their agents within the Lebanese diaspora, especially the millions of Lebanese that have fled Lebanon in the wake of the end of the civil war in 1990, but even in the mid-80s. So Hezbollah just embedded their agents and they established their bases of operations in the continent. And from there, we could see the first result of this coming together of Iranian agents and Hezbollah's operators with attacks in Argentina in 1992 and 1994.
Yeah, and I think it goes without saying, I'm sure many of us here know, Hezbollah is the Lebanese armed resistance group that is armed and directed by Iran. So they have a very significant reason to embed forces there. One thing with Hezbollah that I've always been curious about is that overlap with a lot of the criminal syndicates that operate in Latin America. Why would a terrorist organization have interest
in crime, in organized crime?
In embedding themselves in organized crime in this particular region?
I like to take that one because I was responsible for I was responsible for studying the case of Hezbollah, and also our agency was responsible for pushing forward the designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which we were the first country in Latin America to designate.
It was very significant.
Hezbollah. It was a significant move. And indeed, Adam, like you said, in the tri-border area in particular, but through all of Hezbollah's operations in the region, what you see is this convergence factor of terrorist organizations and organized crime working together, primarily to generate resources for terrorist financing purposes. Right. So it's organized crime, it's criminal activities that provide the resources, the vast majority of resources that Hezbollah then wires off to Lebanon and to other parts of the world where it conducts its operations. That's why it's important to focus on the terrorist financing aspect as well, because the threat that it represents, it's a threat to global peace and security. Sometimes what money that may be flowing through the financial systems of Argentina, of Brazil, of Paraguay, and other parts of Latin America, you may not see it directly connected with a terrorist attack taking place in that location, but it may have an effect, it may have an impact, causing violence and damaging other countries or lives in other parts of the world.
And I think this is also something that certainly the general reader, but the public in general isn't aware of, that what happens so far away from America's backyard in the Latin American region is actually tied up there. Can you talk about, though, because this has been going on for decades now, why it continues? Why is this not being cracked down on more? I think the U.S. has its own role to play, but from the countries there itself, talk about your experience a little bit with trying to kind of cut these networks down.
Yeah, I mean, I'll react to that one too. I think the main reason is been, first of all, lack of interest in Washington on the issue, unfortunately, with some exceptions during recent past administrations where a lot of support was given to really focus on the issue and crack down on it. Generally speaking, there's been very little interest here, but also combined with complacency from local administrations in the governments of our countries. Look at Argentina's government today. It's a government that has been, well, first of all, it's a government that's run by a criminal organization. And I say this with all the knowledge of having signed 7 of the 14 accusations against Cristina Kirchner. But, you know, it's a vice president of Argentina that has entered into a deal with Iran, and that is interested in developing and furthering the Iran-Argentine relationships. We just had an airplane that landed in Argentina that used to belong to Mahan Air, a U.S. sanctioned airline, now has been seized under a seizure order by DOJ. Complacency in Brazil as well, I have to say, unfortunately. After our designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, we traveled to Brazil with Congressman Pittenger, who's around here in the audience and organizes these amazing forums of security and parliamentary intelligence and security forums. And we had a meeting with Bolsonaro and with Bolsonaro's son. Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, said to me personally in public, in front of senators and legislators, I want to apologize to President Macri for not having signed that designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization together with you. We're very sorry we were not there with you, and we promise to take care of this matter and solve this issue as quickly as possible. We're still waiting for Brazil's designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. I don't expect it to come under Lula's administration, but I was very hopeful that it could come under Bolsonaro's administration. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And so the complacency combined with the lack of interest from here, I think, has been a combined adverse factor that has been capitalized by Iran and by Hezbollah, its proxy.
And I think we'll get back to that lack of interest because I do want to follow up on that. But I want to broaden this out to our other panelists. This nexus of the terrorist and the criminal network, and the way it's being dealt with or perhaps not being dealt with. I'd be curious for thoughts and reaction.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to ask the question that you did first, in order to, from a geopolitical point of view, you were asking about the Navy ship, Iranian Navy ship.
That's right.
Sailing to Panama Canal. That has to do well with, I could say, with a middle of international order in transition. You have defined the main characteristic of a great power competition. I could add, we should add great power confrontation too. That means that other actors are going to challenge the power of the United States in the region. Those, in fact, are one of a frigate, which is the name Donna, and the other is a tanker ship called Makran that are going to be sailing to the Panama Canal. Why? Because of this political, challenge to the United States. But not only that, I would say, because of the Ukrainian and Russian war, Russian are going to be, are going to diminish their influence in Latin America. The question is who is going to take it. And in my personal opinion, probably Iran is going to take that position because it's sailing of arms to the region, drones, who knows. And also, the presence of those two ships have to do with the oil embargo to Iran, that they are going to be sailing to Venezuela, probably, challenge in the Canal, the United States, and came back with oil to Iran. This is, in my opinion, the answer to your first question.
And I'd like to emphasize the names of those tankers. That's a bit of information I've not seen out there. I've not even seen that in the Farsi language press, the Iranian press. So that seems quite significant to me, and I think important for a lot of us in this room to be following up on that information. What you said, though, certainly makes me think about the energy piece of this, the oil, the Iranians bringing their oil to Venezuela, forging foreign policy deals with Venezuela as well. Now, we know this isn't the only focus for Iran, but I think it has been a significant one. I'd like for us to get into that a little bit and discuss now this really big influence of illicit Iranian oil and also infrastructure in the region.
I see in a way that the same as we see with Hezbollah. In my opinion, Iran looks at Latin America as a way to circumvent the sanctions. Oil is one of them. All those crimes that Hezbollah conduct, like cocaine trafficking, money laundering, arms dealings, and everything. This money, like Mariano said, it flows back to Lebanon and perhaps Iran as well, since Iran is the basic financier of Hezbollah, but Hezbollah makes a lot of money out of crime. You have an idea. We have been countering Hezbollah's drug trafficking operations in Brazil, that they are linked with the countries in West Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Jordan. And this is at the tip of the iceberg. Like Mariano said, there are a whole lot of operations that they conduct in the continent, and they make a lot of money. And I think even in coming back to that issue they were talking about, designation, I think one of the reasons, Mariano, that I believe that it was not designated in Brazil, in my opinion, is that terrorism is still seen by governments as the attack. If the group does not attack, does not blow up anything in a country, in a region, generally the top tier of the politicians, the government, do not see as a threat. So when we talk about terrorism, we can't forget that terrorism is a cycle of activities that lead up to the attack and that follow the attack. So we would have recruiting, radicalization, financing, logistics, and then we have the attack, then we have evasion, media exploitation, everything. I would say that the whole cycle happens in Latin America, but not the attacks, since Argentina's attacks 30 years ago. So I think that's one of the reasons that the governments do not see that as a threat, at least, in my opinion, in Brazil. And they say, okay, we have more pressing issues to deal with, like PCC, Comando Rojo, and other groups. And then they look at Hezbollah and said, okay, this is another public security issue as for an organized criminal organization, not a terrorist one. And then what we do not see, that's the importance of looking at the whole umbrella, or the whole globe, is that, well, what's behind it? And when we see Iran behind it, we see a logic in that. It's like the oil in Venezuela, all this drug trafficking, all this money laundering, and the real estate they're buying. So it goes well beyond it, in my opinion.
See, and I love that point. I think it's so vital to bring up, and I'll let both of you respond in a moment. Just to say that, and it's something I say often in foreign policy work and covering foreign policy, often people do not care what I'm writing about unless something is on fire or it's blowing up. Otherwise, foreign policy news doesn't seem to be very attractive to people. But it's important for all these other reasons prior to the blowing up and the fires that are taking place. Before I move on, though, I'd like to... Anyone?
No, I just like to add that I think, in my view, Iran is also seeking to expand across Latin America its own revolution. Iran has expansionist ambitions as well. It's not just there, to help Hezbollah penetrate and position the threat, but it's also there with the intention to exert influence across the region and expand its cultural revolution across the region. And that is a factor that is often, overlooked. But when we analyze how the attacks in Argentina took place, the first layers of penetration were through cultural attaches. The increase of cultural attaches in Iranian embassies is also an issue of concern that should be closely monitored, because that was the pattern that was followed when and that led to the radicalization. So. And it's certainly, it's interested in positioning itself, in expanding its networks, in exerting influence, in expanding its trade. And also, of course, as you mentioned, Christian, in evading U.S. sanctions, in evading, international economic sanctions. And the gateways to that, the door openers to that are primarily the three dictatorships of our region, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, that have been opening the doors for that penetration and facilitating the sanctions evasion in Latin America, which is a key reason why I think the United States should be paying full attention to what's happening.
And they're not nearly enough, and we will bring ourselves to that. Before I move on, was there any other thoughts on that?
Well, from the Chilean point of view, it is important to focus the attention on what are the main motivation, goals of the Iranian region. That's why we need to share information. Because at the moment, from the Chilean point of view, we're more worried about China activities in the Southern Cone. As you know, there is a special a facility in Argentina to control satellite from China. And now it was announced this week an effort of China to build a port in Rio Grande, which is going to be a huge port. Why? China is building a huge port in that part of the region to control the Ocean, the Pacific Ocean with the Atlantic, to control the Antarctica, and for what reason? I mean, those, in my personal opinion, are worries from Chile and a challenge and threat that worry most than Iran at the moment.
And also, I think something that the CCP has been doing, not just in Latin America, but all around the world, that is eating up ports, getting countries into debt crises, going in, making them in debt to China. This is part of their larger kind of plan of really gaining a foothold, I think, into many countries, and we can touch on that more. But I did want to go back to one of the things we mentioned, which is sanctions evasion. I think that's a big reason why we see the Iranian penetration. But with the war in Ukraine, Russia actually has had to evade quite a bit of sanctions lately by the U.S. and international partners. And one thing that I've written about and that I read recently was that Russia was eyeing Iran, Tehran, as a sanctions evasion hub because they're very good at it. It made me wonder, though, how both countries are using Latin America. I was hoping we could touch on that a little bit and some of the challenges there.
I can take that to begin with. I think one of the issues that should be understood is that the vast majority of countries across the world, and certainly most of them in Latin America, do not have sanctions regimes in place.
That's important.
That's very important to note. We are used to hear, to speak about sanctions as something natural. We see sanctions being issued every day. We understand the role of OFAC, and the role that Treasury plays in basically waging this war through economic and financial sanctions.
Has Treasury been aggressive in their policing of sanctions? I would ask, because I'm personally curious, since the Biden administration came into place? I
would say not enough so. Certainly not, because secondary sanctions are not being enforced. And so countries like, Latin American countries that facilitate the investments of look, in my country, in Argentina, there is no law that prohibits the Argentine government, any Argentine company, or any Argentine citizen from dealing, entering into business relationships, trading, or conducting financial transactions with any sanctioned individual. That in and of itself represents a huge incentive for sanctioned Russians to operate in the and the same is true for most of the countries in our region. So I think Treasury should be from a not only operational and enforcement angle more aggressive, but also from a policy perspective, encouraging more democracies across Latin America to implement sanctions regimes, to be able to tag along the coalition of democracies in putting pressure on Russia and on other rogue regimes like Iran or North Korea, by the way, who have the opportunity to evade sanctions through jurisdictions that do not implement these type of mechanisms.
And it seems to me a lever the U.S. could be pulling that it's not necessarily pulling at the moment. I'd be curious for that nexus, that Russia sanctions evasion network issue, and how both of y'all see it.
Well, as you said, as Mauricio said, I mean, we should agree to have a stronger regime in the region in order to agree sanctions.
I mean, would this be a tool in policing? Would this be a tool that would make it easier to break up some of the things, the tangible impacts that would be the money flowing, the drugs flowing, the crime happening? I mean, this is all interconnected, I would say.
I mean, we have many problems in the region. One of the problems is how we're going to fight criminal organization. I mean, we don't share information at the moment. How we are going to deal with those problems that are probably more important. I mean, we should start in the region establishing a network of information. But at the moment, because it is highly ideological,
doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. And that's our main problem. I mean, not confident that we are going to improve the situation, that issue.
I think that's important. And we spoke about this a little bit.
And I think also, like Mariano said, the logic behind the sanction, right? In Latin America, this is not our logic. It's something akin to terrorist proscription lists. For instance, for us, terrorism is under the law an act. We do not work with proscription lists. So this is also one of the barriers to, okay, how to designate Hezbollah. Okay, Brazil designates those that were designated by United Nations Security Council, just the three of them, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Oh, we don't have a proscription list sort of thing. And it is something similar to the sanctions logic, right, Mariana? At least I see from my perspective. Correct. So we don't see it that way unless you have a court that ruled that company must be punished, and then it's sanctioned. Otherwise, it doesn't look that way. So the strategy should be something different.
Even the notion of terrorism is different in every country.
Right.
We don't have the same notion. How we are going to deal with that phenomenon if we don't agree in the notion of terrorism?
Right, and these discussions don't seem to be happening. I think that's actually why it's vital that we've all come together here. I did want to pivot to China and bring up one thing that I know we wanted to discuss, and that I think is big in all the countries that y'all are experts in, and that is China and debt. And we touched on it a little bit, but how this has really impacted various nations. Like I was saying before, I think it's being replicated by China, not just in developing African countries necessarily, but also being applied in Latin America. And that's integrating themselves, like you said, into ports and also into economies. And I think this raises issues of financial integrity, having the Chinese in these systems. It's necessarily damaging to democratic freedom. It's necessarily damaging to stability, especially if you want increased ties with the U.S. I was hoping we could get some thoughts on that issue.
I can take the first crack if I may again. No, I think Latin American governments that are very challenged, particularly post-COVID by fiscal stress, by economic crisis, they're tempted to accepting Chinese money, to accepting the Chinese bailouts and loan-based projects offered by China, which they're faster to get approved.
Yes.
The conditions, they seem easier for governments to accept, although they have a huge cost for the country, perhaps. For the governments themselves, maybe politically easier to swallow. And in some cases, they come along with bribes as well. So they're rewarding for them. And so that, I think, combined with the resurgence of the political left in Latin America, which is sympathetic to China's expansion and penetration as an alternative to, capitalist financial markets and all the conditions that come along with IMF loans, World Bank loans, and loans from Western democracies. Makes it attractive for China to capitalize. I think that's one of the reasons, but it's certainly concerning. Look, I brought here with me a quote by the head of Southcom's very recently, who said that Chinese state-owned companies on both sides of the Panama Canal could be turned quickly towards military capabilities. Many of these Chinese state-owned companies have ties to the People's Liberation Army and are involved in around 40 port infrastructure projects at this moment, from Mexico down to Peru. That, combined with 11 satellite ground stations in Latin America, provide China with strategic positioning in the Western Hemisphere. This was a recent quote by the head of Southcom.
Yeah. And one thing we spoke about before we came on, this is where I brought up the context of 5G internet, which seems like a relatively minuscule issue, but actually isn't when a China comes in and offers to build this cheap, and your cell phones, your information is all being stored in CCP computers. That might not be a problem for today, but it certainly could be for tomorrow. I was curious if we have Any other thoughts on that issue? Because I think it's a very major challenge facing the region.
I think that in that issue also something that is interesting about China's soft power is that it's very diversified. So in a way, it goes in through infrastructure projects, 5G technology and everything. But at the same time, they advance within the universities, cultural centers, language courses. They finance, research on their technology. They sponsor studies for undergrad and grad students to go to China for a year, 2, 3, and bring back the projects. So it's a multi-level approach whenever they talk about their foreign policy towards our countries in the South, at least in Africa, in Latin America. And I think it goes hand in hand with a very long-term policy, like we're talking at them right before, right? Because they look at long-term, 20, 30 years.
Exactly.
So they can keep pace with that. They can, they have enough time to pull up the strings and to converge things within, a medium term, 4, 5, 10 years. And something that we don't see on our side in democratic governments that we change every 4 years or so. So I think this is one point that we have to look at, how they also, embed culturally? How do they also progress in that field, but in tune with their infrastructure and technological projects and strategies?
And what you said about consistency from administrations to administrations, officials to officials, I think that's very important. Now, John, before we came out, raised in an email to me one thing that I actually found very interesting and hadn't thought about, and that was his point about the lack of a Chilean national security architecture. And yes. I wanted to expand on that.
No, sure. Since I'm going to comment some few comments about what you were saying. China, it's in the middle of a geopolitical fight in the region too, geopolitical one. Demanding from some countries position in order to settle there, and to support also their illegal fishing fleet that comes to the region from time to time, every year. And also there is a close economic relationship from 2010. The inversion of Chinese is 160 billions in the region. And in the borrows, China borrows to the country of the region 138 billions of money. And the bilateral interchange between Latin America and China is 149 billions. There is an important actor, no doubt about it. It is the main commercial partner of Brazil. It is the main commercial partner of Chile. We export more fruit to China than lithium.
Right.
And copper and everything. But the question is that this is an economic relationship, not a strategic one, because neither Brazil nor Chile is implementing, let's say, an important set of weapons in our armed forces to have a strategic relationship. And I would say that the challenge is how we are going to manage that relationship. If you have your main commercial partner here, but at the same time, you are not building a strategic relationship. We have to create a way or a strategy to deal with that. And in that, it seems to me that the position of the United States is going to be key if they are more worried about the region, about what the external actors are doing now in our territory. Because it's a matter of sovereignty. And having said that, it seems to me that China is going to be more aggressive in the years to come in the region. I have no doubt about it. And also is going to take the vacuum of power that Russia left in the region because of the war. Let's say in weapons, for example. And also we should agree what are the security challenges, because we're very worried about that new port that they are building in the southern part of Argentina, because it's going to affect the Chileans anyway. I mean, because of the position to the Antarctic, to the control of the ocean and illegal fishing.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I think there are a lot of areas I didn't get to cover that I would have liked to, but I did want to open it up and see if there are questions. I think we have a very important opportunity here for experts to speak to experts. And that exchange of ideas, of anything this has taught me, is that the exchange is not happening nearly as much as it should be. So I wanted to see if that's maybe an opportunity for folks here.
And to answer your question.
Yes.
The one thing that you can notice in Latin America is that the different countries don't have a security architecture, don't even have a strategy, national security. And this seems to me a great vulnerability that we're going to face, because without national security architecture, without intelligence, without information, call it whatever you want it, quality of information, we need a very good quality of information. We need to share information among the different countries. And if we are not going to build that architecture, believe me, we're going to be defeated, not only by the external actors, but for the current security threat that we're facing. Let's say criminal organization, narco traffic. Sometimes you thinking the criminal organized crime versus the disorganized state, how we're going to deal with that if we don't have that kind of architecture. I would put that goal as one of the first goals, at least in Chile, in the next month, trying to build a national security architecture to deal with the current threat, to deal with the external actor too.
So, to that end, do we have anything from the audience? Yeah, let's start. I don't know if we have microphones, but I think we're in a small enough room that you can project. I see you there, yeah? Oh, we do have a microphone. All right, so we'll pass that around. Let's get some questions.
Very quickly, Mr. Federici mentioned Cuba, and it seems to me it's sort of absent because Venezuela, Russia, Iran, their entree into the hemisphere seems to have come through Cuba. Cuba also had the tricontinental meeting, which was organizing terrorists in the 1960s to the present, and they have a office of Hezbollah apparently in Havana, not to mention also the RA and others. Could you tell me a little more about Cuba's role in this, and if it should be countering Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China? Thank you.
All right, and just as a guide, we'll try to keep this rapid fire, and let's get some info out there. Do we want to address that question?
Well, as for Cuba, as far as I know, this close relationship with Venezuela, of course, we have like a cauldron of interest there. There is Hezbollah, there are other organized crime, criminal actors in there, there are Colombian insurgents in there. All of them, they have, been interacting with Cubans and everything. But the Cubans, they have much of a lower profile. We just don't see them on the surface. You don't see them on the surface in Latin America. If they are there, they are under, other passports and other identities. They are well trained to operate in these environments without being seen. It's pretty much like some of the Hezbollah's operators that they keep coming back and forth from the tri-border area down south to Venezuela and Colombia. How do they move around? What are their routes? Who they are? We barely know them. So this is how it's like a very cloudy environment. So it's different to tell them apart, because sometimes you have somebody with a Venezuelan passport, but he is not even a Venezuelan, as a lot of people here know in this room. They have been issued Venezuelan passports without being nationals. And they can disguise an accent, and even they can move around Latin America with a Cuban accent on a different passport. People barely notice, at least in Brazil, because we are not Spanish speakers. So
my understanding is that the Iranians don't even have to forge documents anymore, that they can very easily get passports and provide these to Hezbollah militants.
Right.
Yeah.
Roger Portamara, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the nice hemisphere, Western Hemisphere.
We got a mic for you.
From 2001 to 2006, it's First of all, wonderful to be here and see this group and so many
Good to see you.
old friends. Yeah. I just want to make a point of information to broaden the aperture of the discussion. And then I do have a question.
Okay.
Probably for you two. The point of information is this concerted effort by Russia, Iran, and China in our hemisphere is we can't just focus on Latin America. The hemisphere is more than that. On the 28th of September of 2018, a Danish freighter, the Venta Maersk, completed the Northern Passage going from Vladivostok to Bremen in Germany. The first time in human history that a vessel has been able to go through the Arctic because of climate change. Everything is going to change as the Arctic opens up. In fact, we need to throw away all our maps. We have the wrong map right now. We're looking at the map, the equatorial projection, the Mercator projection. We need to look at at least for a month just to see the world through different eyes, at a North Pole centric map and see how it looks to our opponents there. China has bought up every single research station in Greenland, and they're not doing research there. Russia is raising the stakes in a very dramatic way in the Arctic. All this is part of this plan. So this action, establishing a port in Argentina, having facilities on either side of the canal, it goes all the way up and down our continent.
Right.
It's
strategic.
Compromising the integrity of the Americas. Period.
Fair? And the question part.
That's the point of information. So the Panama Canal is actually critical in all this. And we now let me put my little Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense hat. We need to think of not what China and company are doing to us in the hemisphere that we don't like. We need to think of what we can do in the hemisphere to China and to Russia that they won't like. And I would like to ask you gentlemen, actually, I'm going to let you off the hook. I don't want to get you in trouble. But about Panama as a facilitator of all this action. 3 Panamanian ships get sunk in the Black Sea. And where's Panama's neutrality? What does that do? Right? By Russian missiles. They're still allowing Russian ships to go through the canal. They're helping laundering all the Russian assets through Panamanian companies. What should we do about Panama? And what does Panama's neutrality mean 10 years from now, 20 years from now, in a world where China is an active, as you said, a confrontation power, not a competition power?
All right.
So what about Panama? What's the problem with Panama? What should we do?
Fellas?
Panama, I can answer that question from the angle that I have analyzed it from, which is the financial integrity angle. That's my expertise. It's certainly a money laundering hub for much of the region, and I've come across it also in our investigations in Argentina. A lot of the corrupt money that fled Argentina and was laundered by corrupt Argentine politicians passed through, landed in Panama at some point or another. Panama has paid and continues to pay consequences for that. It's gray listed by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. It has been there for the past, since the Panama Papers broke out. It's been the longest lasting gray listed country there. And this has begun to affect its economy and the integration of its financial system. I mean, it's losing correspondent banking relationships. It's unable to maintain the ones that it has. This has been having an impact on the development of its economy. But the system is built up in a way that the leadership has been really reluctant to change. The reason why they have not been able to get out of the gray list is because they have not committed to implementing the action plan of reforms that would get them out of that gray list. And it's an issue of leadership. It's an issue of entrenchment of its leadership within its system. And what more to do is really at least on the financial integrity side, is a complicated thing. Certainly not let them off the hook. And I say that because, as simple as it may be for this audience, perhaps, to understand that Panama should not be left off the hook, some countries are being let off the hook in terms of economic and financial sanctions across the region. We're seeing Venezuela sanctions being eased, generating huge confusion among those of us that have been, fighting and have been contributing to the full pressure campaign on Venezuela's sanctions. So hopefully Panama will not, end up along that path either.
And sir, also touching what you said about the map and how we should look at the map. We should look at the counterintuitive routes and everything, like you just said. And as we talk about Latin America, and I agree, we can't have just the focus, the lenses on Latin America. We have to look the whole globe. For instance, as we talk transnational organized crime, nowadays, for instance, a third of all the cocaine that reaches Europe goes through West and Northern Africa. A few years back, that would be less than a tenth. And I'm talking about maybe 200 tons, 300 tons a year that reaches Europe through West Africa. Wow. Why? Why don't they ship straight from Brazilian ports or Colombia or Venezuela straight up there? Because they found a way to circumvent also law enforcement cooperation, in which the general said, within Latin America, we don't have that very much developed. We still need to develop much more. But with other continents, it's way less. But the criminals, they know it. They know how to circumvent us too. The same as why do they go through the Arctic Circle? Because they know that's a counterintuitive route and they know less patrol and everything. And when we reach also Panama, and that touches migrant smuggling that was being spoken here before, we see scores of migrants that come, for instance, from Africa, Middle East into Brazil. From Brazil, they leave overland, undocumented, all the way to the U.S.-Mexican border. And Panama is the bottleneck. So they all meet there, Darien Gap and everything. So a lot of stuff happens in Panama. A lot of money comes to their aid in Panama. People make money out of them in Panama. So there is, once these routes are becoming more and more commonplace, there are more and more people making money. Like Joseph said, the amount of money that migrant smugglers make, now it goes way beyond what cocaine traffickers do. So people are shifting business. So these guys that do the cocaine trafficking routes in Africa, some of them are shifting into migrant smuggling instead of, but the other way around. So that's the way that you have to look in a counterintuitive way, because these guys are working in counterintuitive routes and everything. So, and that I think that what came to my mind when you said about the map, because the Arctic is the same thing as far as I think.
I think it's time to start wondering whether we should add Panama to the list of rogue nations in the Americas.
So we're reaching the end of our time. We're passing it a bit, but I did want to make sure not to let our final speaker
I would add that
go on.
Probably we're in the middle of two geopolitical shifts. One of them, of course, I do agree with you, what is happening in the Arctic now. And it seems to me that we're going to suffer the same confrontation and competition in the Arctic, in the Antarctica, in the next few years. You know, that's why China is doing that port in the south of Argentina. It's very clear to me. And the other geopolitical change or shift is that the international Latin American criminal organization are reaching the entire southern corner. We in Argentina were not used to have that presence, neither in Chile. Brazil, many years ago, was also out of that influence. But now they are in the entire region. And this is very worried. We used to have a rate of 6 assassinations for 100,000 inhabitants. We used to. The average of Latin America is 30. You know, the higher in the world. The 85 kidnapping in the world occurred in our region. But we used to have only 6 as Uruguay. Brazil has among the first 50 most violent cities in the world. 15. And we used to have 6, as I said before. But what is important thing? Because of the criminal organization that are reaching our borders and our country, now we're suffering the same competition of the region inside the country. And now the average in Chile in some county in Santiago is 18 and 19 assassination each 100,000 inhabitants, which is huge. And I have to add that the main thing that you can notice is that the international criminal organization, let's say from Mexico, let's say from Venezuela, let's say from Brazil, are disputing a geopolitical control of the territory in the southern corner of our region.
All right. I think we're ending it there. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you all. I wish we could have done more questions, but sadly we have run out of time. And I want to thank Joseph for having all of us here. This has been just great, so thank you all.